So this is the area that Bebbington sees the difference. Is he right? Yeah. Not completely. Because the area of missions, were the Puritans interested in missions? Yes, they were. You have examples like John Eliot in New England, who translates the Bible into Massachusetts. There is not one person alive on the earth today who can read that Bible in native Massachusetts. Those people don't exist. One of the great, it's invariable in history. It goes all the way back to the Romans. We shouldn't, people bewail, okay, it's the West that's been doing this all around the world. No, the Romans did this too, is that when you have the development, either politically or economically, of kind of an imperial rule, invariably smaller groups are swallowed up, and sometimes their distinctives are lost. And there's been a hue and cry in recent days about the fact that there are Native American languages, and I'm not sure the names, that we're losing. There are some languages today where there's only 5 or 6 people of a Native American tribe who could still speak that language, and they're all in their 70s or 80s. And I remember reading an article in National Geographic, and there's something very sad about that. And people say, well, it's the American, those Anglophone Americans are, causing this. No, hey, the Romans did this too. I mean, this is just a part and parcel of human history. But there is a sadness. It's like there should be a sadness that there's how many Bengal tigers are there in the wild? Like 300? Or just the wonkiest idea that killing rhinoceroses in Africa for their horn as an aphrodisiac. And how many rhinoceroses are there in the wild? I forget how many. There's a deep, that's just sadness. And when a human language is lost, something's lost. There's a part of human culture, it's just lost. But nobody speaks Massachusetts anymore, but Eliot was concerned about reaching those people. And so the Puritans were not completely without missionary concern. But who is it who does something big terms of beginning a whole movement? What's the evangelicals? And the first society is Baptist. It's the Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Among the Heathen, which has been shortened to the BMS, the Baptist Missionary Society, that sends William Carey to India. And there has been a never-ending flood since that day. And America is still the greatest, at this point in time. In the 19th century, it was Britain. Today, in the 20th century, and even still today, America is still the largest sending missionary. More missionaries sent out. I forget the percentages, but I think the next, is Korea, and I think they're 1/3 of America. And where does that come from? It comes from here. It's not the Puritans. So Bebbington's right. Now, Bebbington has reasons for arguing that, which I don't want to get into because of time. So this is a very important question. Are we part of the stream of Puritanism? Yes. I'm an evangelical. I am not ashamed to describe myself that way. I know there are some evangelicals today who don't want to use the term. Everybody's an evangelical, So what does it mean? Well, hey, every term can. There are all kinds of Baptists out there, right? I could name you 5 people who are Baptists, and we wouldn't have much in common with 2 or 3 of them. Everybody from Rick Warren, Billy Graham, to Bill Leonard, who used to teach here, to Molly Marshall, whose office I apparently occupy. I won't get on Molly. She's now the president of American Baptist Seminary in Kansas City. There are all kinds of stories about her, about what she would be up to. And she was one of Dr. Muller's main opponents. She's a Baptist. And so, hey, the word Baptist is elastic. Reformed. Reformed's elastic too. You got Reformed men like R.C. Sproul, and then you've got, who was the guy with the Crystal Cathedral? Schuller, right? He was part of the RCA. I mean, he never talked about sin. I mean, any word is elastic, but the first thing I am is a Christian. The second thing I am is an evangelical. And that is my focus in my life is the gospel. And my first calling is to bring people to know Christ and into his kingdom and to grow in that. My first calling is not make people Baptists. Not make people Calvinistic Baptists. I'm a Baptist and I'm a Calvinist, and I love what those things stand for, but my first calling is the gospel. And so I'm not ashamed to say these are my roots. But there are links back to Puritanism, most definitely. But in this, there's something different that takes place in the 18th century. And when people said in the 18th century, it's the old Puritanism revisited or redivivus, it's come back to life again, yes and no. There was something different. What people did not know is that God was raising up these revivals to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. The Puritans had not done that. They'd taken the gospel to North America, but as Jonathan Edwards said in his 1750 sermons, on a number of occasions, he said, you know, we English men and women, we came here to America with the gospel. What have we done with it? We have taken, this is preaching to Indians, Haykin and Mohawk Indians. We have taken your land, but we have not given you the gospel. And that's Jonathan Edwards. That's not some sort of 20th century, early 21st century hater of Western culture who happens to teach at Harvard in the history department and is writing a revisionist history. That's Jonathan Edwards. But that changed. Edwards had a passion. Edwards, we can argue, is a grandfather of modern missions. And Edwards had a passion for the gospel. And when you look at the life of Wesley, you see that. So let me turn now to John Wesley. I took a lot longer on that, so we may not be finished by 10 after 8. We'll see. John Wesley is born into a household with rich Puritan background. So let me put John Wesley down here. Now, if we were doing a complete family tree, we would have to put Wesley had 18 brothers and sisters. Only 8 survived into adulthood, so we'd have to put them all alongside him. He has 2 brothers, Samuel and Charles, both of whom will survive. But we're just going to put John. John's father is Samuel Wesley, and his mother is Susanna Ansley. For many years, I used to say Ainsley, but I don't know. Something doesn't. I think it's Ansley. I don't know. It could be Ansley. It could be Ainsley. Anyway, I think it's Ansley. I'll talk a little bit about his parents in a few minutes. His father's father, so his paternal grandfather, is John, notice the T, Wesley. And John Wesley was born in 1636. He died in 1678. He was a student of John Owen. He was a Puritan. He got kicked out of the Act of Uniformity in 1662. His father was Bartholomew Wesley. Again, please note the T. And his dates are 1595 to 1670. And so for over 200 years, there were ministers in the family. He was a Puritan too. He got kicked out of the Church of England. John Wesley's mother, her father was Samuel Ansley. And he was a very well-known Presbyterian. He's much better known than the 2 men who are the forebears of his father. And 1620 to 1696. And one of his forebears, it would have been his mother. His mother was a white, and so you go back to his grandfather, which would be John Wesley's, let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. His great-great-grandfather, John White, 1590 to 1645, was a Puritan. On both sides, he's got Puritans. Both of his parents were raised as Puritans. When his father inherited, remember I said a sum of money from John Owen. When his father inherited that money, he used the money to go and train for the priesthood in the Anglican Church. Owen would have been completely nonplussed. Owen had no interest. After he left the Church of England and was kicked out, he had no interest in ever going back. He didn't believe that the whole idea of a state church was right or biblical. Anyway, when Samuel Wesley rejoins the Church of England, he drops the T out of his name. Coincidental? Possibly. Probably that the STL is a difficult pronunciation in English. Wesley. I have to get the T in there. I've got to stop and make an emphasis on the T. Wesley. You can easily hear the Wesley. You can see why the T would get dropped in pronunciation. So, was the T dropped because of pronunciation? Possibly. Was the T dropped because he was making a point about cutting off making a change from his forebears? And it's interesting he drops it when he rejoins the Church of England. We don't know. Why did he rejoin the Church of England? We don't know. What is a likely reason he rejoined the Church of England? It's quite likely that his generation, well, this is not quite likely. We know this. We know this from others. We don't know if this is true of him. Again, how do historians reason? Often when we don't know something, we can't give first-hand documentation. We can look and see surrounding events and say, this is like that, or this happened because the other things that happened like this also happened because of that. There were other men of his generation, other young men of his generation, who are now outside the Church of England. They were now Baptists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians, and there was no future for them. There's no future politically. They could never hold political office. There's no future educationally. They could never graduate from university. There's no future in the Army or the Navy. They could never be an officer. They're going to be always a second-class citizen. And for many of them, they didn't bear the brunt of the persecution. These are the children of the people who went to prison. And for many of them, they no longer shared their parents' depth of convictions. This is another reason why Puritanism begins to lose ground and fire and begin to change, is because the rising generation either rejected their parents' values or no longer saw the point of them. Okay, maybe it was important to you, but we're in a new world now. And Samuel Wesley, if he was like many of his generation, just didn't see the point of staying outside the Church of England. Didn't see that many value for him. So he rejoins the Church of England. That's a possible argument. Susanna Ansley, she also rejoins the Church of England. She is the youngest of Samuel Ansley. Samuel Ansley has 25 children. He was married twice. His first wife died, giving birth to their first child. His second wife at 24. She must have been pregnant pretty well every year and a half or so of their married life. Is that typical? It's not untypical, let me put it that way. Women still do die in childbirth in North America. My wife works as a medical scientist in a hospital, and We were talking last night, and the issue came up of young mothers dying. And she said to me, yeah, we have a few every year. We never think of it. We think of childbirth as it's a pretty easy procedure. It is now, largely. It never used to be. Let's say all the men in this room are married. Half of us, my wife would have died with our first child. Half of us will lose our wives with our first children. And before we die, we'd have been married 2-3 times. That's not atypical. It's very sobering. We have the benefits we've had medically in the last 150 years are absolutely remarkable. Some of it was avoidable. Doctors knew nothing about germs, and often doctors would come from examining corpses to delivering babies. Not smart. Without washing their hands. That's the key part. Without washing their hands. And a lot of women died with septicemia, blood poisoning. Anyway, so Samuel Ansley's first wife died giving birth. His second wife had 24 children. Susanna was his youngest and dearest in some ways, kind of like the Joseph. And when she was 12 years old, she drew up a list of 20 reasons or so, gave it to her father in writing, and said, I'm leaving the Presbyterian Church, and I'm going back into the Church of England. We're not told what those reasons were. We've lost them. They were burned in a fire. When she married Samuel Wesley, she still got them, but after a number of years of marriage, there was a fire in their house, and they were burned. So we don't know why. It wasn't... If she was going to convince her father to allow her to do this, she's 12 years old, she must have had more, hey, it just isn't cool to be a Presbyterian anymore. The future's with Anglicanism. It would have to be more than that. What's amazing is she's 12 when she comes up with these reasons. That tells you something about her future. She is an incredibly strong woman. She will run the Wesley household. Partly because when she gets married, she marries a man who's he's not a nice guy. 2 little stories that illustrate this. One is he has a daughter whose name is Mehetabel. I think that's an absolutely gorgeous name. One of the things you do not want to ask me regarding advice is children's names. I have a whole list of weird children's names. At least my kids think so. They are eternally grateful that my wife's opinion prevailed when we were naming. I would have loved if I'd had a Mehetabel. It's just gorgeous. She was known as Hetty for short. She was engaged to she wasn't engaged, she was being courted by a young Christian man. For some reason, Samuel took a mislike to him. Banned the man from the house, forbade his daughter to see her, and commanded her and forced her to marry a godless, drunken plumber. Godless and drunken don't necessarily go with plumbers, but who is to beat her? Who knows why? There are reasons, I'm sure, that are known why he did this. But he was not nice to his children. The other classic story is in 1702, the year before John is born. John's born in 1703. This is a long issue. Samuel Wesley was, in 1688, there was a revolution in England. And I've already talked about this. Remember, James II got kicked out, and he was succeeded by his daughter-in-law, his daughter and son-in-law, William III. There were some English men and women who didn't believe William III was the rightful king, and they still held allegiance to James. Samuel was not one of them. He was ardently devoted to William III. So ardently devoted, because, as you will see, that he's prepared to experience a rupture in his married life. On this occasion, well, he knows his wife doesn't believe that William III is the proper king. She thinks James II is still the proper king. Now, he was dead by this time, so it would be his son. Oh, might have been James Edward. I forget the details. Anyway, he's living in France. And so Samuel says at dinner one night, I would like to raise a toast to the king. Well, at that point, that's cool. Both of them could toast the king. They're just toasting different people. And then he went on to specify, William III. Well, he knew his wife didn't believe William III was the proper king, and he knew she wouldn't join him in the toast. She sat down, she remained seated and refused to toast the king. He was furious. He basically said to her, I'm not going to stay another night in a house with a woman who's unloyal to the king. And he left. Left for 6 months. He's the minister of the church. I mean, you pull a stunt like that today, you wouldn't have a ministry left. You wonder, what was the church thinking? This guy takes off. He took off to London. He lives in Lincolnshire, which is halfway up the English, halfway up England, and took off to London. His wife didn't see him for 6 months. They had some correspondence. Finally, his wife convinces him, Sir, what you're doing is a dreadful witness to the gospel and Christian character. You need to come home, sir. And so he comes home. And about 10 months later, John Wesley's born. And sometimes people say that John Wesley was the fruit of the reconciliation of Samuel and Susanna. But he's not. He's just a weird man, an imperious man. There's a bit of John in that, as we'll see. So John's born in 1703. He's educated in his early years by his mother. His mother homeschools all her children up to about the age of 10 or 12. And then the boys would go away to a boarding school called Westminster School in London. The eldest son is Samuel. He will be the first to go. Then John will join him, and then eventually Charles. We're not going to talk anything about Charles's life. Samuel, neither. Samuel becomes an Anglican minister. He never embraces evangelicalism like his two brothers. The school they go to, Westminster College, they would be there from around the age of 13 to 19. Is a school in which the only language that would be spoken in lectures and the classroom and in the hall and in the refectory where they would eat is Latin. If you're caught speaking English, you are fined. So John Wesley, it's a living language. People say Latin died out with the Romans. It didn't die out with the Romans. In fact, if this was Harvard in the 1820s, I'd be lecturing in Latin. And if you couldn't follow the lecture, you wouldn't be here. You would all be able to read and write and speak Latin. It's amazing. And when Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who we've met, the Moravian, when he came to America in the 1740s, he meets a great American Presbyterian minister in New England named Gilbert Tennant. Tennant can't speak German. Zinzendorf really can't speak English, but they can both speak Latin. So what do they converse in? Latin. It's really kind of interesting. So that gave Wesley a great grounding in the classics, in languages. He goes up to Oxford University and graduates from Oxford with his BA in 1725. He'll eventually get his MA there. And while he's there, he becomes part of a thing called the Holy Club. And the Holy Club was a group of young men who were trying to live a godly life in the midst of an ungodly age. The Holy Club. It was founded in 1729. It eventually comes to an end in the 1730s when they're all graduated. The person who founded it is Charles. John wasn't part of the founding, but as soon as he finds out about it, he comes back to Oxford and takes it over. John in 1725 starts keeping a diary. He will keep 3 main diaries all his life. One diary is, and that's why we know a lot about his life. It's tremendous. One diary is all of the major events that would take place in a day, major conversations, books he read, and so on. A second diary, which actually was in secret code. He adapted a very common form of shorthand called Byrom, B-Y-R-O-M, Byrom shorthand. He adapted it to his own adaptation. The code was not broken until, I think, the 1970s, somewhere in the late 20th century. It really doesn't tell us much more. Who knows why he kept it in code. Maybe it was because of ease of writing. The other diary is fascinating. And the other diary I compared to his Twitter account. If you'd been hearing this lecture 20 years ago, and I assume I lectured on Wesley because I taught church history 20 years ago and whatever, I wouldn't have talked about his Twitter account. Twitter didn't exist then. But when Twitter came along, I thought, man, that was made for John Wesley. John Wesley would get up. He normally got up. He was an early riser. Most of these men were. When you ever reread these men complaining about the sin of lying in, they're talking about sleeping till 7 o'clock. I don't know how many of you are early risers. I'm not an early riser. Part of the reason because I go to bed so late. Going to bed. And I'm very grateful to have married a wife who loves to stay up late too. So if we go to bed at 1, 2, no big deal. So for me, sleeping in is sleeping till 9 or 9:30. When we had those 2 snow days, remember those 2 snow days a couple of weeks ago? That was brilliant. I slept, I think, till 11. I mean, from the Puritan point of view, man, I'm a sluggard. I mean, those guys will be up and at 'em by 6 and 7. Wesley was up and at 'em by 4. And when he got up, the first thing he would do is he'd write in this diary, 4 a.m., got up. And then he would do what in the Old English would be called doing your toilet, which is shaving, washing, dressing yourself. 4:15. Every 15 minutes later, he'd write 4:15, washing my face. I'm serious. I am serious. 4:30, completed my toilet, preparing to pray. 4:45, praying. 5 o'clock, praying and reading scripture. 5:15, concluding my prayers. 5:30, having breakfast. Now you know why it's a Twitter. I'm amazed what people put on Twitter. And Wesley was made for Twitter, or Twitter was made for Wesley. 5:45, still eating my breakfast. This is true. This is God's honest truth. He starts this in 1725. He continues it till 1790. We know exactly everything Wesley was doing, or at least what he tells us he was doing, every 15 minutes of every day, of every week, of every month, of every year of his life. Now, maybe he missed a few. There's something obsessive about it. I'm amazed at people who, all the tweets they do. I get, if I was Wesley, if I was preaching, I'd have to stop, It's for the historian, it's absolutely brilliant. Because we can track him. We know where he was, when he was there, who he preached to. Exactly. It is a historian's treasure, Wesley's Twitter diary. So Wesley had these diaries that were going on that really kind of give us an understanding of his own inner life. And he's honest in his diaries. He tells us. We'll see on one occasion when he's confronted with the gospel, and he's asked, do you believe in Jesus Christ? And he'll say, I believe he is the Savior of the world. And then he'll add in his diary after that, I fear they were vain words. He didn't say that out publicly, but that's what he thought. And so we can see the psychology of conversion as we follow him and so on. In 1736, he comes up with a brilliant idea of going to Georgia. As he would later say, I went to America to convert the Indians, but who will convert me? And he convinces his brother Charles to go with him. They sail on a ship with the governor. The governor is a man named James Oglethorpe. He is the first governor of the colony of Georgia. James Oglethorpe does not like the slave trade, and he is not going to allow slavery in Georgia. And one of the sad events will be that George Whitefield will convince Oglethorpe to have slavery in Georgia. Theologically, I'm much more akin to Whitefield than John Wesley, but Wesley understood the abomination that slavery was. Whitefield never did. If he had lived longer, we hope he would have. But Whitefield purchases land near Savannah to establish an orphanage. Good works. He needs people to work the land. He knows that in Carolinas there are slaves. He asks Oglethorpe, do you think we could bring slaves into Georgia? Oglethorpe, there's absolutely no way that this is going to be a slave-holding colony. No way. And Whitefield brings them in anyway. And then basically compels and forces and cajoles Oglethorpe to admit the presence of slaves. Whitefield is a critical figure in bringing slaves into Georgia. And we note those sort of things with sadness, but we also know those things to realize we are all sinners, even in our Christian life. We don't note those things and say, how much superior we are to George Whitefield. We know the evil of that. He didn't. We're superior. We are thankful that God has mercy on us, because I'm sure later generations look back on us and say, how on earth could they have allowed this sin in their presence? He convinces Charles to go to Georgia with him as a missionary. Charles doesn't want to go. John says you're going, so they go. And that tells you something about their relationship. It's not the first time. When they get to Georgia, they've gone across the Atlantic. They sail to Georgia. This is brilliantly stupid. They sail to Georgia in January. I don't suppose anybody here is, I shouldn't say nobody, but has anybody here been on the Atlantic in January? No. Yes? Sorry? Okay. You've been to, sailing across it is quite a different thing. I remember I raised that question once in a class, and a guy puts his hand up. He'd been in the Royal Canadian Navy. He had been in the Atlantic in January. And I'd never known this, but he said sometimes in storms, the trough, from the crest of a wave to the trough can be anywhere from 60 to 80 feet. So you're in the real big storms. You're like riding a roller coaster. And that's in modern, can you imagine that in a modern ship? Can you imagine that in a ship made of wood? 18th century ship made of wood, which hold is a quarter of this size of this room. Well, that's what they hit. They hit a number of storms while they're going across. We have John Wesley's diary, which records the whole event. And in one of the storms, it's a Sunday, John Wesley is leading worship. And on board the ship are a group of German-speaking Moravians, led by one of the great Moravian leaders, August Spangenberg. Wesley and Spangenberg would talk to each other in Latin. So, it's a Sunday morning, a small hold, about a quarter of the size of this room. There's a group in this corner, English, Anglicans, Wesley's leading worship. The German Moravians are over there singing hymns. Suddenly, a wave breaks over the ship. The ship is going up and down. A wave breaks over the ship, and it comes cascading. The water comes cascading down because they're in the hold, so the floorboards above them are the deck of the ship, and the water comes pouring down. A huge screaming breaks out among the English. They are confident the ship's going down. Wesley himself is confident the ship's going down into the hold of the depths of the sea. The one thing he remembers later is the Germans, the Moravians, singing through the whole thing. Afterwards, he spoke to Spangenberg, and he said, "Was you not afraid to die?" "No, sir. I'm thankful that God enabled me not to." "Were not your men afraid to die?" "No, sir. We were not." And Wesley's upping the ante. Okay, you're a minister of the gospel. You should have some assurance of salvation. Okay, you're not. Were the men? No, they're not. "Were not your women and children afraid to die?" "No, I thank God they were not." And Wesley notes about how it struck him with deep conviction, because he said, I am afraid. I'm a minister, and I was afraid to die. Where is my faith? Spangenberg later noted that, and when they got to Georgia, Spangenberg had a conversation with him, in which he asked him, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ?" And Wesley said, "Yes, I believe he is the Savior of the world." And he puts in brackets in his own, what he thought, "I fear they were vain words." Spangenberg pressed him again, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you know yourself?" And what Spangenberg noted is that Wesley did not use a personal pronoun. It was the Savior of the world. He didn't say my Savior. It hit Spangenberg. He does not have a personal faith. They get to Georgia. It's a disaster. Charles doesn't want to be there in the first place. He takes the first opportunity to skip out of the colony. He goes north to Boston, spends a few weeks in Boston. There's just been released, actually, about within the last 4 or 5 years, the diary of Charles in Boston. Fascinating diary, because an Anglican in Puritan Boston, and then makes it back home to England. John stays on for 2 more years. He converts no Indians. He meets a couple. He meets an Indian chief. Is the big thing that we remember of John's time here is he falls in love with one of his congregants in the congregation. She doesn't reciprocate his love. In fact, she marries another man. The first Sunday back after their honeymoon, they come forward for the Lord's Supper. He's the minister. They would come to the railing, and he's coming along with the bread, and he comes to her. She's there. He goes around her and gives it to the next person. He doesn't offer it to her. She's furious. Rightly so. Big mistake on his part. She's a friend of James Oglethorpe. She goes to Oglethorpe and basically tells him what John's up to, and that's the end of John's ministry in Savannah. He's kicked out of the colony. In shame, comes back to England, a completely failed missionary. He says, I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who will convert me? Here he is then. He's been part of a holy club. He's a minister. This is now 1738. He's been a minister 13 years. He's 35 years old. He thinks his good works will save him. One of the friends of Spangenberg is a man named Peter Böhler. He's got that umlaut, that little to do dots over the O. In German, that's an umlaut. We call it in English a diaresis, but it's an umlaut, U-M-L-A-U-T. Bonhoeffer's name has an umlaut in the second O, which means that we say Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It should be Bonhoeffer. But Peter Böhler was a Moravian. And Spangenberg writes back to the Moravians in Germany, to Zinzendorf, and says, I had this fascinating conversation with the Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley. They're Anglican clergymen. And when John goes back to England, he writes another letter, and he says if they're in England, and if ever any of our brethren are coming through England and stay some time in London, maybe they could look them up and talk to them. And so it was. Peter Buller was on his way to South Carolina, one of the Carolinas, as a missionary. I think it was South Carolina. And so he stops in London. He stops there for a few months. And he spends time with both of them. He is instrumental in the conversion of both John and Charles. I won't talk about Charles' conversion, but Charles was converted on May the 21st, 1738, Pentecost Sunday. It's a very appropriate day. John was converted that Wednesday at 8:45 p.m. We know that. We know it exactly, because in his diary he would later say, at 9:15, someone was reading Martin Luther. It was actually a man named William Holland. We know that from other sources. William Holland, a Moravian. Wesley had gone to a little Bible study, a Moravian Bible study, in Aldersgate Street. That street still exists in London. You can go there. I've been there once. The house where he was converted no longer is standing. But he says, I went very unwillingly to a Bible study or a Bible society at Aldersgate Street, and at 9:15, while Martin Luther's preface to his commentary in the Romans was being read, I felt my heart strangely warmed. And I knew that Christ had died for my sins, even mine. It's very significant, the link to the Reformation, because Wesley's core preaching will be total depravity, that we are lost in sin and under the judgment of God. We need to experience the new birth and be justified by faith alone. Wesley preached that. And he wasn't a Calvinist, but he preached that. And it's also very important, he heard. He didn't read. He heard it. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Now, some Methodist historians have debated, was this his conversion event? Or was it rather a second blessing? I tend to think it was his conversion, not because I don't believe in a distinct second blessing. But it's not theologically why I'm driven that way. I'm driven that way for two historical reasons. Number one, before this, nobody ever complained. Before his conversion, nobody ever complained about his preaching. Nobody ever got upset with him. This woman in Georgia got upset with him. Hadn't got anything to do with his preaching. No. After this, all kinds of people get upset with him. And when he's preaching in all kinds of places, like the time he went to Wednesbury, spelt like Wednesday, but with a bury instead of day, Wednesbury, he goes there and there's two gangs turn out. They're going to heckle him. And they have a pitched battle in front of the pulpit. He's out in the open air. This isn't in a church. Pitched battle in front of the pulpit to heckle him. And when they start to heckle him, they're throwing rotten eggs and tomatoes at him and bits of dead cats, we're told. I don't know whether they found a dead cat and chopped it up, or they killed a cat and chopped it up. Either of them are horrific, but be that as it may. Didn't bother Wesley at all. Wesley was the sort of man, Whitefield, this is interesting, Whitefield, when he faced a hostile mob, inwardly he feared. He would stand his ground, but with great fear at times. Wesley loved it. He just, the wilder the better. He just kind of thrived on it. There are people like that. I've got a friend who's my age, and he still goes for, it's paraskiing, I think they call it. You go off to the Rockies, and they drop you down with a helicopter at 8,000 feet up, or maybe they're not that high. I don't know how high up. Anyway, he's 60 years old, and he's skiing down like a mad Fenian, and he just thrives on this sort of stuff. And that's Wesley. Just the wilder the better, the wilder the mob. It just kind of gets him going to preach the gospel. And after he was converted, or this event, on May the 24th, 1738, all kinds of people got angry with him. Nobody ever got angry with him before, because he wasn't preaching anything but moralism. Secondly, before this event, he never records anybody being converted. After this event, there are thousands who will thank God for the day they heard John Wesley. Like the father of a woman named Phoebe Palmer. We'll talk about her in a few weeks. He was 10 years old. In 1785, his father took him to hear John Wesley at 5 o'clock in the morning. And he put him on his shoulders so he could see him. And at 10 years old, he was born again. And for him, John Wesley became one of the great heroes of the faith. And he schooled his daughter, Phoebe Palmer, who becomes a remarkable figure in 19th century Methodism in this rich history about John Wesley and Charles and so on. So, was he converted? Yes, he was converted.